others.
I have.
After Ezio had taken leave of Leonardo and settled into his own lodgings, he wasted no time in making his way back to the Palazzo Setta, not an easy task in this city of alleyways, twisting canals, low arches, little squares, and dead ends. But everyone knew the palazzo, and locals willingly gave him directions when he got lost, though they all seemed at a loss as to why anybody should wish to go there of their own free will. One or two suggested that it would be simplest for him to take a gondola, but Ezio wanted to familiarize himself with the city, as well as to arrive at his goal unnoticed. It was late afternoon as he approached the palazzo, though it was less of a palace than a fortress or a prison, since the main building complex had been erected within the battlemented walls. On either side, it was hemmed in by other buildings which were separated from it by narrow streets, but to its rear was what looked like a sizable garden, surrounded by another high wall, and at the front, facing the canal, was the wide, open area Ezio had seen earlier. Here now, though, a pitched battle seemed to be taking place between a bunch of Barbarigo guardsmen and a motley group of young people who were taunting them and then skipping lightly out of reach of their swinging halberds and stabbing pikes, throwing bricks, stones, and rotten eggs and fruit at the infuriated uniforms. Perhaps they were just creating a diversion, for Ezio, looking beyond them, could see a figure scaling the wall of the palazzo beyond the scene of the melee. Ezio was impressed. The wall was so sheer that even he would have thought twice about tackling it. But whoever it was reached the battlements without detection or difficulty, and then, astoundingly, leapt up from them to land on the roof of one of the watchtowers. Ezio could see that the person was planning to jump again from there to the roof of the palace itself and try to gain access to the interior from there, and he made a note of the tactic should he ever need or be able to use it himself. But the guards in the watchtower had heard the person land and called a warning to their fellows on guard in the palace proper. A bowman appeared at a window in the eaves of the palace roof and fired. The figure jumped gracefully, and the arrow went wide, clattering off the tiles. But the second time the archer fired, his aim was true, and with a faint cry, the figure staggered, clutching a wounded thigh. The bowman fired again, but missed, since the figure had retraced its steps, skipping from the tower roof back down to the battlements, along which other guardsmen were already running, then leapt back over the wall and half slid, half fell down it to the ground. On the other side of the open space in front of the palazzo, the Barbarigo guards were pushing their attackers back into the alleyways beyond, down which they were beginning to pursue them. Ezio took this opportunity to catch up with the figure, which was beginning to limp away to safety in the opposite direction. When he caught up, he was struck by the person's light, boy-like but athletic shape. As he was about to offer his assistance, the person turned towards him, and he recognized the face of the girl who tried to cut his purse in the market earlier. He found himself surprised, confused, and curiously smitten. "Give me your arm," said the girl urgently. "Don't you remember me?" "Should I?" "I'm the one you tried to rob in the market today." "I'm sorry, but this is no time for comfortable reminiscences. If we don't get out of sight fast, we'll be dead meat." As if to illustrate her point, an arrow whizzed past between them. Ezio put her arm round his shoulders and his round her waist, supporting her as he had once supported Lorenzo. "Where to?" "The canal." "Of course," he said sarcastically. "There's only one in Venice, isn't there?" "You're damned cocky for a newcomer. This way, I'll show you, but be quick. Look, they're after us already." And it was true that a small detachment of men had started across the cobblestones towards them. One hand gripping her wounded thigh and tense with pain, she guided Ezio down an alley, which led to another, and another, and another, until Ezio had lost all sense of the compass points. Behind them, the voices of the men pursuing them gradually receded and then were lost. "Hirelings brought in from the mainland," said the girl in tones of great contempt. "Don't stand a chance in this city against us locals. Get lost too easily. Come on." They had arrived at a jetty on the Canale della Misericordia. A nondescript boat was tied up there with 2 men in it. On seeing Ezio and the girl, one immediately started to unloop the mooring rope, while the other helped them in. "Who's he?" the second man asked the girl. "No idea, but he was in the right place at the right time, and apparently he's no friend of Emilio's." But she was close to fainting now. "Wounded in the thigh," said Ezio. "I can't take care of that now," said the man, looking at the bolt where it had lodged. "I haven't got any balsam or bandages here. We must get her back fast, and before those sewer rats of Emilio's catch up with us." He looked at Ezio. "Who are you, anyway?" "My name is Auditore, Ezio, from Florence." Mine's Ugo, she's Rosa, and the guy up there with the paddle is Paganino. We don't like strangers much." "Who are you?" Ezio replied, ignoring the last remark. "Professional liberators of other people's property," said Ugo. "Thieves," explained Paganino with a laugh. "You take the poetry out of everything," said Ugo sadly. Then he suddenly became alert. "Watch out!" he yelled, as one arrow, then another, thudded into the hull of the boat from somewhere above. Looking up, they could see 2 Barbarigo bowmen on a nearby rooftop, fitting fresh arrows to their longbows. Ugo scrabbled in the well of the boat and came up with a businesslike stubby crossbow, which he quickly loaded, aimed, and fired, while at the same time Ezio flung 2 throwing knives in quick succession at the other archer. Both bowmen plunged screaming into the canal below. "That bastard's got goons everywhere," said Ugo to Paganino in a conversational tone. They were both short, broad-shouldered, tough-looking men in their 20s. They handled the boat skillfully and evidently knew the canal system like the backs of their hands. For more than once, Ezio was convinced they had turned into the aquatic version of a blind alley, only to find that it ended not in a brick wall, but a low arch under which the boat could just pass if they all bent low. "What were you doing attacking the Palazzo Setta?" Ezio asked. "What's it to you?" answered Ugo. "Emilio Barbarigo is no friend of mine. Perhaps we can help each other." "What makes you think we need your help?" retorted Ugo. "Come on, Ugo," said Rosa. "Look what he's just done, and you're also overlooking the fact that he saved my life. I'm the best climber of the lot of us. Without me, we'll never get inside that viper's nest." She turned her face to Ezio. "Emilio is trying to get a monopoly on trade within the city. He's a powerful man, and he has several counselors in his pocket. It's getting to the stage when any businessman who defies him and tries to maintain his independence is simply silenced." "But you aren't merchants, you're thieves." "Professional thieves," she corrected him. "Individual businesses, individual shops, individual people, they all make for easier pickings than any corporate monopoly. Anyway, they have insurance, and the insurance companies pay up after fleecing their customers of giant premiums, so everyone's happy. Emilio would turn Venice into a desert for the likes of us. Not to mention that he's a piece of shit who wants to take over not just local business, but the city itself," put in Ugo. "But Antonio will explain." "Antonio? Who's he?" "You'll find out soon enough, Mr. Florentine." At last they reached another jetty and tied up, moving quickly, since Rosa's wound needed to be cleaned and treated if she were not to die. Leaving Paganino with the boat, Ugo and Ezio between them half-dragged, half-carried Rosa, who had by now all but lost consciousness from loss of blood, the short distance down yet another twisting lane of dark red brick and wood to a small square, a well and a tree at its center, and surrounded by dirty-looking buildings from which the stucco had long since peeled. They made their way to the dirty crimson door of one of the buildings, and Ugo rapped a complex pattern of knocks on it. A peephole opened and shut, and the door was swiftly opened and as swiftly closed. Whatever else had been neglected, Ezio noticed, hinges and locks and bolts were well oiled and free of rust. He found himself in a shabby courtyard, surrounded by high, streaky grey walls, which were punctuated by windows. 2 wooden staircases ran up on either side to join wooden galleries that ran all round the walls at first and second floor levels, and from which a number of doorways led. A handful of people, some of whom Ezio recognized from the melee outside the Palazzo Seta earlier, gathered round. Ugo was already issuing orders. "Where's Antonio? Go get him. And clear some space for Rosa. Get a blanket, some balsam, hot water, a sharp knife, bandages." A man raced up one of the staircases and vanished through a first-floor doorway. 2 women unrolled a very nearly clean mat and laid Rosa tenderly down on it. A third disappeared to return with the medical kit Ugo had requested. Rosa recovered consciousness, saw Ezio, and reached a hand out to him. He took her hand and knelt down by her. "Where are we?" "I think this must be your people's headquarters. In any case, you're safe." She squeezed his hand. "I'm sorry I tried to rob you." "Think nothing of it. Thank you for saving my life." Ezio looked anxious. She was very pale. They would have to work fast if they were indeed going to save her. "Don't worry. Antonio will know what to do," Ugo told him as he stood up again. Hurrying down one of the staircases came a well-dressed man in his late 30s, a large gold earring in his left earlobe and a scarf on his head. He made straight for Rosa and knelt by her, snapping his fingers for the medical kit. "Antonio," she said. "What happened to you, my little darling?" he said in the harsh accent of the born Venetian. "Just get this thing out of me," snarled Rosa. "Let me take a look first," said Antonio, his voice suddenly more serious. He examined the wound carefully. "Clean entry and exit through your thigh. Missed the bone. Lucky it wasn't a crossbow bolt." Rosa gritted her teeth. "Just get it out!" "Give her something to bite on," said Antonio. He snapped off the arrow's fletching, wrapped a cloth round the head, soaked the points of entry and exit with balsam, and pulled. Rosa spat out the wadding they'd placed between her teeth and screamed. "I am sorry, Piccola," said Antonio, keeping his hands pressed on both points of the wound. "Go fuck yourself with your apologies, Antonio!" yelped Rosa as the women held her down. Antonio looked up to one of his entourage. "Michiel, go and fetch Bianca." He cast a sharp eye on Ezio. "And you, help me with this. Take those compresses and hold them on the wounds as soon as I remove my hands. Then we can bandage her properly." Ezio hastened to obey. He felt the warmth of Rosa's upper thigh under his hands, felt the reaction of her body to them, and tried not to meet her eyes. Meanwhile, Antonio worked quickly, elbowing Ezio aside at last and finally gently articulating Rosa's immaculately bandaged leg. "Good," he said. "It'll be a while before we have you scaling any battlements again, but I think you'll make a full recovery. Just be patient. I know you." "Did you have to hurt me so much, you clumsy idiota?" she flared at him. "I hope you catch the plague, you bastard! You and your whore of a mother!" "Take her inside," said Antonio, smiling. "Ugo, go with her. Make sure she gets some rest." 4 of the women picked up the corners of the mat and carried the still protesting Rosa through one of the ground floor doors. Antonio watched them go, then turned again to Ezio. "Thank you," he said. "That little bitch is most dear to me. If I had lost her—" Ezio shrugged. "I've always had a soft spot for damsels in distress." "I'm glad Rosa didn't hear you say that, Ezio Auditore. But your reputation goes before you." "I didn't hear Ugo tell you my name," said Ezio, on his guard. "He didn't. But we know all about your work in Florence and San Gimignano. Good work, too, if a little unrefined. Who are you people?" Antonio spread his hands. "Welcome to the headquarters of the Guild of Professional Thieves and Whoremongers of Venice," he said. "I am Di Maggianis, Antonio, the Administratore." He gave an ironic bow. "But of course we only steal from the rich to give to the poor, and of course our whores prefer to call themselves courtesans." "And you know why I am here?" Antonio smiled. I have an idea, but it's not one I've shared with any of my employees. Come, we should go to my office and talk. The office reminded Ezio so vividly of Uncle Mario's study that at first he was taken aback. He didn't know what he had expected exactly, but here he was confronted by a book-lined room, expensive books in good bindings, fine Ottoman carpets, walnut and boxwood furniture, and silver-gilt sconces and candelabras. The room was dominated by a table at its center, on which sat a large-scale model of the Palazzo Seta and its immediate environs. Innumerable tiny wooden mannequins were distributed around and within it. Antonio waved Ezio to a chair and busied himself over a comfortable-looking stove in one corner, from which a curiously attractive but unfamiliar smell wafted. "Can I offer you something?" Antonio said. He reminded Ezio so much of Uncle Mario that it was uncanny. "Biscotti? Un caffè?" "Excuse me, a what?" "A coffee." Antonio straightened himself. "It's an interesting concoction, brought to me by a Turkish merchant. Here, try some." And he passed Ezio a tiny white porcelain cup filled with a hot black liquid from which the pungent aroma came. Ezio tasted it. It burned his lips, but it wasn't bad, and he said so, but added injudiciously, "It might be better with cream and sugar." "The most certain way to ruin it," snapped Antonio, offended. They finished their coffees, however, and Ezio soon felt a certain nervous, energetic buzz that was new to him. He would have to tell Leonardo about this drink when he next saw him. As for now, Antonio was pointing at the model of the Palazzo Seta. "These were the positions we had planned if Rosa had succeeded in getting in and opening one of the postern gates. But as you know, she was seen and shot, and we had to withdraw. Now we will have to regroup. And in the meantime, Emilio will have time to strengthen his defenses. Worse than that, this operation was costly. I am almost down to my last soldo." "Emilio must be loaded," said Ezio. "Why not attack him now and relieve him of his money?" "Don't you listen? Our resources are under strain, and he is on the alert. We could never overcome him without the element of surprise. Besides, he has two powerful cousins, the brothers Marco and Agostino, to back him up, though I believe Agostino, at least, to be a good man. As for Mocenigo, well, the Doge is a good man, but he is unworldly, and leaves matters of business to others who are already in Emilio's pocket." He looked hard at Ezio. "We need help to fill our coffers again. I think you may be able to provide that help. If you do, it will demonstrate to me that you are an ally worth helping. Might you undertake such a mission, Mr. Cream and Sugar?" Ezio smiled. "Try me," he said. 14. It took a long time, and Ezio's interview with the skeptical chief treasurer of the Thieves' Guild had been uncomfortable, but Ezio was able to use the skills he'd learned from Paola to cut purses with the best of them, and to rob the rich burghers of Venice allied with Emilio of as much as he could get. A few months later, in the company of other thieves, for he was now an honorary member of the guild, he had brought in the 2,000 ducati Antonio needed to relaunch his operation against Emilio. But there was a cost. Not all the guild members had escaped capture and arrest by the Barbarigo guards, so that while the thieves now had the funds they needed, their manpower had been depleted. But Emilio Barbarigo made an arrogant mistake. To make an example of them, he placed the captured thieves on public display in cramped iron cages around the district he controlled. If he'd kept them in the dungeons of his palazzo, God himself would not have been able to get them out. But Emilio preferred to show them off, deprived of food and water, prodded with sticks by his guards whenever they sought sleep, and meant to starve them to death in full public view. "They won't last 6 days without water, let alone food," Ugo said to Ezio. "What does Antonio say?" "That it's up to you to plan a rescue." "How much more proof of my loyalty does the man need?" thought Ezio, before he realized that he already had Antonio's confidence. to the extent that the Prince of Thieves was entrusting to him this most crucial mission. He hadn't much time. Carefully, Ugo and he observed in secret the comings and goings of the watch. It appeared that one group of guards continuously passed from one cage to the next. Though each cage was constantly surrounded by a clutch of curious rubberneckers, among whom there may well have been Barbarigo spies, Ezio and Ugo decided to take the risk. On the night shift, when there were far fewer observers about, they made their way to the first cage when the guard was just about to leave for the second. Once the guard had departed and were out of sight and earshot, they managed to spring the locks, their spirits raised by a desultory cheer from the handful of bystanders, who couldn't care less one way or the other who had the upper hand, so long as they were entertained, and some of whom followed them to the second cage and even to the third. The men and women they liberated, 27 in number, were already, after 2.5 days, in a sorry plight, but at least they had not been individually manacled, and Ezio led them to the wells that could be found in the center of almost every frequent square, so that their first and most important need, thirst, was satisfied. At the end of the mission, which took from candlelight to cock crow, Ugo and his liberated associates looked at Ezio with deep respect. "Rescuing my brothers and sisters was more than just an act of charity, Ezio," said Ugo. "These colleagues will play a vital role in the weeks to come, and," his tone became solemn, "our guild owes you an undying debt of gratitude." The group had arrived back at the guild's headquarters. Antonio embraced Ezio, but his face was grave. "How is Rosa?" asked Ezio. "Better, but she was hurt worse than she thought, and she tries to run before she can walk." "Sounds like her." "It's typical." Antonio paused. "She wants to see you." "I'm flattered." "Why be? You are the hero of the hour." Some days later, Ezio was summoned to Antonio's office and found him poring over his model of the Palazzo Seta. The little wooden mannequins had been redeployed around it, and there was a pile of papers covered in calculations and notes on the table by its side. "Ah, Ezio." "Signore." "I have just returned from a little foray of my own into enemy territory. We managed to liberate 3 boatloads of armory destined for dear Emilio's little palazzo. So, we thought we might organize a little fancy dress party with us dressed in the uniforms of Barbarigo archers." "Brilliant. That should get us into his fortress without any problem. When do we start?" Antonio held up a hand. "Not so fast, my dear. There is a problem, and I'd like to ask your advice." "You honor me." "No, I just value your judgment. The fact is, I have it on the best authority that some of my people have been suborned by Emilio and are now his agents." He paused. "We cannot strike until the traitors are dealt with. Look, I know I can depend on you, and your face is not well known within the guild. If I were able to give you certain pointers about the whereabouts of these traitors, do you think you could deal with them? You can take Ugo with you as a backup, and whatever task force you may require." "Messer Antonio, the fall of Emilio is as important to me as it is to you. Let us join hands in this." Antonio smiled. "The very answer I expected from you." He gestured Ezio to join him at a map table, which had been set up near the window. "Here is a plan of the city. The men of mine who have defected meet, as my own local spies tell me, in a taverna here. It's called Il Vecchio Specchio. There they make contact with Emilio's agents, exchange information, and take their orders." "How many?" 5. "What do you want me to do to them?" Antonio looked at him. "Why, kill them, my friend." Ezio summoned the group he had hand-picked for the mission the following day at sunset. He had laid his plans. He dressed them all in Barbarigo uniforms from the boats Antonio had sequestered. Emilio, he knew from Antonio, believed that the stolen equipment had been lost at sea, so his people would suspect nothing. Together with Ugo and 4 others, he descended on Il Vecchio Specchio soon after dark. It was a Barbarigo hangout, but at that time of night only a handful of customers were there, apart from the turncoats and their Barbarigo controls. They hardly looked up as they saw a group of Barbarigo guards enter the inn, and it was only when they were surrounded that their attention turned to the newcomers. Ugo pulled back his hood, revealing himself in the half-light of the taverna. The conspirators made to rise, astonishment and fear written in their faces. Ezio placed a firm hand on the shoulder of the nearest traitor, then, with a detached economy of effort, thrust his now-released codex blade between the man's eyes. Ugo and the others followed suit, and dispatched their traitorous brethren. In the meantime, Rosa had continued to make a gradual and ever-impatient recovery. She was up and about, but she depended on a cane to get around, and her damaged leg was still swathed in bandages. Ezio, despite himself, and constantly making mental apologies to Cristina Calfucci, spent as much of his time as he could in her company. "Salute, Rosa," he said on a typical morning. "How are things? I see your leg is healing." Rosa shrugged. "It's taking forever, but I'm getting there. And you? How are you finding our little town?" "It is a great city, but how do you cope with the smell of the canals?" "We're used to it. We wouldn't like the dust and filth of Florence." She paused. "So, what brings you to me this time?" Ezio smiled. "What you think, and also not what you think." He hesitated. "I was hoping you could teach me how to climb, like you do." She tapped her leg. "Time was," she said, "but if you are in a hurry, my friend Franco can do almost as well as me." She raised her voice. "Franco!" A lissom, dark-haired youth appeared almost instantly in the doorway, and Ezio, to his private mortification, felt a pang of jealousy that was apparent enough for Rosa to notice. She smiled. "Don't worry, tesoro. He's as gay as Santo Sebastiano. But he's also as tough as old boots. Franco, I want you to show Ezio some of our tricks." She looked out of the window. An unoccupied building opposite was covered with bamboo scaffolding tied together with leather thongs. She pointed. "Take him up that for a start." Ezio spent the rest of the morning, 3 hours, chasing after Franco, under Rosa's strident direction. At the end of it, he could clamber up to a giddying height with almost all the speed and address of his mentor, and had learned how to jump upwards from one handhold to the next, though he doubted if he'd ever reach Rosa's own standard. "Lunch lightly," Rosa said, sparing him any praise. "We haven't finished for the day." In the afternoon, in the hours of the siesta, she took him to the square of the massive red-brick Frari church. Together they looked up at its bulk. "Climb that," Rosa said, "up to the very top, and I want you back down here before I have counted 300. Ezio sweated and strained, his head swimming with the effort. 439, announced Rosa when he rejoined her. Again. At the end of the 5th attempt, an exhausted and sweating Ezio felt that all he wanted to do now was smash Rosa in the face, but that desire melted when she smiled at him and said, 293. You'll just about do. The small crowd that had gathered applauded. 15. Over the following months, the Thieves' Guild tackled the tasks of reorganizing and refitting. Then, one morning, Ugo arrived at Ezio's lodgings to invite him to a meeting. Ezio packed his codex weapons in a satchel and followed Ugo to the headquarters, where they found Antonio in an ebullient mood, once again moving the little wooden mannequins around the model of the Palazzo Seta. Ezio wondered if the man wasn't a little obsessed. Rosa, Franco, and 2 or 3 of the other senior members of the guild were also present. Ah, Ezio, he smiled. Thanks to your recent successes, we are now in a position to counterattack. Our target is Emilio's warehouse, not far from his palazzo. This is the plan. Look. He tapped the model and indicated lines of little blue wooden soldiers ranged around the perimeters of the warehouse. These are Emilio's archers. They represent our greatest danger. Under cover of night, I intend to send you and a couple of others up to the roofs of the buildings adjoining the warehouse.